Good morning and welcome to the very first of our Energy UK Power Talks. My name's Dhara Vyas. I am Energy UK's Chief Executive and I'm delighted to have Chris Stark with me here. We have a live audience. What we're going to do is have about half an hour of conversation between Chris and I, and then we're going to go to the audience in the room for questions. I hope you really enjoyed today's session. We'll do some wrap up at the end and then we'll share more information about what we're going to do next. So if you're happy to start, Chris.
Of course, yeah.
Welcome. I'm just going to do a sound check in the room. Can everyone at the back hear me? Okay, great. I think this is such a lovely opportunity to have you here. And lots of people who are in our room today have told me to make sure I really grill you.
Okay.
I think it's safe to say that most people online and in the room have heard a little bit from you in the last 7 months. And what I'd really like to do today is to get under the skin of it a little bit, ask you some questions, give you some space to respond. But for those of you who haven't met Chris or heard from him before, Chris is the head of mission control. He's probably got the best job title in the world right now. He's head of mission control for the Clean Power Mission. So he's based out of the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. He is a climate and energy expert and he is the former chief executive of the Climate Change Commission. And I think that I think it's safe to say that we're all really pleased in the industry when you got this job. I think it's
I hope that's true.
brilliant. Well, I think
not
I
everyone
think,
else. I think that's awesome.
Look, I think we were, and I think that it's been really interesting to have you navigating this space because you are not a politician,
No.
but nor are you a behind-the-scenes civil servant. You know, you've got this interesting space, you've got a voice, and you've got a very unique role. And I think it's worth me just kicking off by asking you, actually, 7 months in, can you reflect a little bit? Is there something that surprised you? Are there things you've enjoyed? Are there challenges?
Yeah, all of those. So I think it's very nice of you to say that. I mean, it is an unusual role that I've taken on. I'm not sure there's an easy template for it. So part of the fun of this has been exploring what you can do in a job like this. If I briefly tell you the story of that, I mean, I had left the Climate Change Committee. I spent ages thinking about what I was going to do next, and I'd gone off to Carbon Trust, an organisation that I still love. And then there was an election, and Ed asked me if I would do this. And it took me almost no time at all to think I wanted to do it because there's such a sort of unique opportunity to come and do something like this. But it was at that point we didn't know what the election result was going to be. Although we had some thoughts about how we might structure it, there was nothing in the department that was ready to, spark up and get going on this. So it's been partly about defining what the job is, partly about defining what you've got to do to hit a target like this, but also building a team around it. And I sort of said from the off that I didn't want to have a big team. My experience of leading teams of about sort of 40 to 50 is that they're the right size, and that's what we have in the department. But basically it's this kind of task of getting everything arranged. And it's brilliant. Like, it's just brilliant. I love it. It's a great job. I wake up every day with a complete sort of mixture of excitement and dread about what's ahead, which is exactly what you want for a job like this. And the whole of the department's behind it. So it sort of feels like it's a much bigger thing now. But it took a lot to get up and running. Yeah. And it's coming up for 8 months now. And of course, I've been living with it for a bit longer. So it feels like we're actually coming to the point where I think I probably had that conversation with Ed. It was a few months away into the spring, I suppose. But a year of thinking about it now. But it does feel like we're up and running now. And that's tremendous. I said this on a few occasions. I don't think we've missed. We've taken every opportunity we could to do the things that we think we needed to do. Don't feel I've really wasted a single day in that 8 9 months. So that's pretty good.
Yeah.
There's lots of things I wish we could have done too, but it's not a bad start.
Okay, I've got signs saying we should try and be louder for everyone at the back, just so you know.
All right.
So it's a bit of projecting your voice, please. I think that's it's lovely to hear. You're certainly everywhere. I think that there's a real kind of energy around you and the team and what you've been doing. A lot of the conversations we seem to have are about investment. Obviously, that's something that our industry is absolutely keenly focused on. You had the NESO modelling followed by the Clean Power Action Plan, We know that we need to invest £40 billion every year between now and 2030. We know that for every pound of public sector investment, we should be unlocking about £3 of private sector investment. So much of the mission relies on that private sector investment. But we've also got an industry that's operating in an increasingly uncertain global world, right? And political uncertainty, concerns around defence and energy security, they all interweave in this space. Do you think the UK is still the best place to invest, and why do you think that?
Yes, of course I have to say that, but I also think that's the job. So we've had to move. So I mean, the primary challenge, of course, is to get a lot of clean energy investment into this sector, and we come off basically a nadir for that with AR5, a collective loss of confidence. So building that confidence up has basically been part one of the job, and what we're trying to do with the Clean Power Action Plan is put our arms around that in a way that we haven't really ever tried before. So specifying in some detail what we think we need to do over the next 5-6 years is quite novel, right? I mean, that is something we haven't really tried to do before. What I hope that does is give us clear a signal as we can to investors that we're serious about what needs to be done, and the investment needs to come to this country. But we've got to fill in, particularly this year, the policy blanks on how it's done. So I sort of feel we're almost at the point where that story of confidence is returned. You're absolutely right about global events, and they are something that you can manage least in a job like this, and we are buffeted by them same way as everyone in this industry is buffeted by them. But we have most of the tools at our disposal to build that confidence. And I feel, you're right, I'm around a lot and I get out around and speak to people a lot. I definitely feel that there's been a shift in the last year, and we've got to build on that this year because it really, really matters. The level of capex that's required for this, you're absolutely right, sort of north of 40 billion per year is an enormous sum in and of itself. It brings huge value to the economy, huge value, I hope, to the consumer as well. But just small margins on that in the cost of capital make big impacts on cost overall. And that is all about confidence. So if we have a policy framework that makes this as clear and as confident as possible for investors and developers, then the overall cost of this will be small.
Yeah, I think that's really fair, and I'm glad you brought up value to the customer, and let's come back to that in a minute. I think that your points actually around how to make sure that we're considering decreasing the risk of those marginal increments to cost of capital are absolutely right. But do you also need to think about how the Clean Power Mission interacts with so many of the other energy policies, and the space that we all occupy is incredibly busy, and the mission needs to interact with so many other parts of that energy infrastructure space, from things like the Warm Homes Plan to investment in that sort of longer term clean power that won't really start to come through to the system until the mid-2030s, you know, decisions on nuclear, decisions on carbon capture, that sort of post-2030 space. But the way that clean power interacts with some of the other government policies probably has most friction right now on the conversation with REMA and the conversation about zonal pricing. And I have at least 4 people in this audience who've asked me to make sure I do ask you about this. So I'm going to ask.
Not a day goes by.
I'm going to ask, and then I'm going to run for cover. Yeah. So, but honestly, that ongoing conversation about zonal pricing is getting really loud.
It is.
And I think it does have an impact on investor confidence. It does. I think it is really worth knowing what your thinking is on this, and I'm sure it's evolving as you read and see more evidence and information.
So let's talk about REMA. So REMA has rumbled on now for quite a while. Although it's actually, when you look at it, I think it's only 2.5 years. It feels longer to me. I don't know how it feels to people in the room. But that's because it's such a big beast.
Yes.
So there's a huge sort of momentum to that work, and when a new government comes in, the first thing you've got to do is sort of drains up, look at it, and that was the period that I came into this job. So there is what has been my primary influence on REMA, it's to get to a decision point on it. Ideally we would have done that last year, but actually the reason to delay the decision on it, the reason to push the decision to this year is that what we put in the action plan is determinative of what you've got to do with REMA. So in particular with zonal pricing, what we essentially said in the action plan was we're going to accept the challenge that a lot of grid needs to be built, that will reduce the constraints that is at the heart of what zonal pricing is looking at. These sort of notional price imbalances in the various price zones will be reduced by building out that grid build. So that is something you've got to factor into the analysis. So sort of point number one is that what we've done is actually a factor in the analysis on REMA. And the second thing is, just as you say, it is going to impact on investor confidence unless we get to a clear decision with all the mitigations that you would expect in place so that we ensure that we get the deployment we need for 2030. So what is my role in this? It's not to decide what to do about the full REMA package or zonal pricing. I mean, I suppose I could try and take that role, but it's not what I see as the challenge. There's a much bigger thing here, looking way beyond 2030. I do, though, have a stake in ensuring that whatever we do on this protects the very rapid deployment that's needed for 2030. And that has been my primary interest in it. So I'm not going to sit on this stage and tell you what I think about zonal pricing, because we're right in squeaky bum time decision space on that right now. What we absolutely must do is reach clear decision on it and communicate that as quickly as we can to an industry that is, I hope, going to go into the next renewables auction and make big investments this year so that they understand what that is as quickly as possible. It has been one of the most interesting topics, as you would expect, of the things that we've looked at across the first sort of year of this job. We are up to, I think, at least the third conversation with the Clean Power Commission, this thing that we put around me to try and advise on how we should do clean power by 2030. And that process has been brilliant, actually, at surfacing the big issues. So I think we'll get to the decision. I am pushing for that decision to happen as quickly as possible, so that when we can have a different discussion in a room like this about how it's implemented, that is the key thing for me.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair answer, Chris.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's often what so many of us have in our conversations is actually we have to interact with all these different policy conversations with different bits of the department. So knowing that you're also thinking about that, I think gives us some reassurance.
So just on that, it's quite interesting that one of the things that's really, I've worked in government before. So years ago I was in the Treasury and spent a very happy period in the sort of heart of government, and then did other various things around, I suppose you could say, the centre of government. Then I went to Scotland, then I did the CCC job.
Yeah.
So I sort of moved from an early career in the middle of government to then being at the edge of it. And then you come into a job like this, and what is so striking is just how complex it is and just how many things are on the boil at any one time.
Yeah.
The kind of beauty of the clean power focus is it's very near term. It requires you to stitch all that together. And one of my big reflections coming into this job is that the sort of power of simple ideas. It's not possible for me to try and herd all those cats all at once, but it's really important that all the cats know that we're doing this thing, because they herd themselves. And it's that sort of idea. Ed, when I took this job, said to me, "Oh, it's like Balkan states. They're all sort of doing their own thing." I don't actually think that at all. I think it was the sort of lack of a binding idea, and the fact that it's so short term, 2030. Really works, actually. So I've learned quite a lot, actually, about how you might organise government. You could do lots of these things across government if you focus on that. I suppose that's what a mission is. But that is how you bring order to that, because otherwise I'm sure you're right that you've got to engage with just hundreds of people in government to try and get a sense of what's going on. If they're all sort of broadly focused on a single thing like this, it just becomes a lot easier. And that is true of REMA as well as, CFD parameters or extending right out to what we're doing on warm homes. All of that does fit underneath some binding concept of doing something quickly in this Parliament. Yeah,
and it's that tension between trying to do something in this Parliament, whereas so much of the investment from the industry has this long-term horizon out to sort of 10, 15 years. Yeah. So it's that tension between knowing how clean power and the 2030 target interacts with those sort of longer term things as well. Look, let's talk a bit about the public. You talked about customer value, consumer value. You and I first met during the UK Climate Assembly.
Yeah.
One of the best projects I think I've ever been involved in. back in 2019. I think 6 select committees commissioned the UK Climate Assembly, and Chris was heading it up, and it was absolutely brilliant. And I totally blame COVID for it not having more of an impact, if I'm honest, because I think it had this huge potential to do so much good and to drive so much change. That aside, we now find ourselves in a situation where we have a Prime Minister who says he's not in the habit of telling people how to live their lives, who wants to tread lightly on people's lives. Yet we also have this mission and this energy transition, and obviously we had the 7th carbon budget last week, where actually the interaction with people and the transition and the way it touches people's lives, homes, livelihoods is going to change. That conversation with the public has to start moving up the agenda. How far up the order of priorities is it for you and the mission?
My experience of doing the Climate Assembly was similar to yours. I mean, I thought it was an absolutely amazing experience. Partly my journey on that was initially a great deal of reluctance of being involved in that process, as we'd just done a lot of heavy analysis, very numerate stuff. And I worried about sort of taking the same issues to a group of people and doing that in a completely different way and coming up with different answers. Turns out actually I was totally wrong on that, and that people are broadly very, very sensible.
Yes.
And that I definitely feel we should do more of that. So the sort of number one thing is that we should not be so frightened about having a discussion with people about all the things that we're trying to do here. But I don't interpret my job directly as doing that. So I suppose that's an interesting challenge to me. I mean, you could do something like that, and I rather suspect we will do more of the direct engagement with people as we progress over the course of this Parliament. But the primary job, to be very clear, in setting this clean power thing up has been looking at investing in big infrastructure and getting stuff built, and doing that at hopefully best cost to the consumer. So that is a job that doesn't directly at least involve me speaking to people as much as I might like to. The next stage of this, though, I would like to take to people a story about how this is going to benefit them more directly. So partly what we published yesterday in the new bill, the Planning Infrastructure Bill. So you've got a story there about discounts for people who are hosting infrastructure. That's the story I've been wanting to tell for a while, but at least we've got that out there now and we can talk about it. The big story I want to tell is that over the course of this Parliament, we are going to do things that will bring the bill down. And I've got a host of ideas of what to do about that, but we've got to make sure that we find the right moment to have that discussion too. I think the big story, though, is not directly about bill discounts or what the consumer sees. I think the story I want to tell people is about how important this is to society, and that it is not just a sort of, occasionally it's said to me, sort of vanity project for Ed Miliband. Absolutely not. It's a much more fundamental thing that we're trying to do. So the sort of clean power story is right at the forefront of a host of other changes, as you say, that are going to play out over decades, or at least a decade. And if we do this well, it has a host of benefits that go way beyond the energy system into jobs, the investment that we're bringing to parts of the country that needs it, the new industries and the supply chains that come with that too. So that's the story I would really like to start to move in to talk about. But I sort of feel this year we've got to get our ducks in a row to have that discussion properly with people, because otherwise it's not credible, right? We've got to say at the end of this year it's working. You can see it happening. This is investment that's going to deliver for the country, and that investment story ultimately is the thing I feel most important. As I've got to make something of that.
Yeah, I mean, look, I agree, but I think that there is a parallel bit of work that you could argue the industry needs to be more on the front foot about, actually, and what's that conversation with the public around, actually, for Clean Power 2030, we need to increase demand by 6 times what it is today. We need to electrify. So that means significant changes to homes, it means significant changes to transport. We also do need that conversation about where do we site infrastructure and the impact. And your point about eventually bringing bills down is really, really timely. Yesterday we published a new report on how to cut bills, which we think is just incredibly important. I think all of our members know that economic anxiety is real for far too many people. The cost of living crisis, the energy crisis has cast a very, very long shadow on far too many people, and debt is at an all-time high. So I think it's, more power to you if you're able to bring the conversation about cutting bills into this space, because the reality is, whilst we know Clean Power 2030 will in the long term bring bills down, there are things that could be happening now which will help with public acceptability.
Your report's super clear on that, and that's similar to my view, right? What we're doing here at the wholesale end is going to bring wholesale prices down for electricity. I quite like that. That's the sort of step one, and then you've got to translate that into more direct benefits to consumers. There's no easy win in this.
There is no easy
but
win.
There's lots of things that we could and should do, and the sort of idea of looking fundamentally at that is something we'll also need to do this year. I think it's very exciting to have that opportunity, but it does ultimately rest on doing this thing, right? So getting stuff built, and I mentioned earlier the kind of primary cost driver of that is making sure that we do that at the lowest possible cost of capital, given the amount of investment that we're going to see in the power system. That is job number one, I think.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and I think it brings us really nicely on to my next question, actually, which is around you're in a room full of energy industry people. We've got excellent colleagues from across the sector online as well. Can I ask you to reflect a little bit on the energy industry, what you think our strengths are, where you think we could be better or bolder?
I think the energy industry is bold. I mean, so what are my reflections coming into? So the way in which this clean power thing has played out, I worried when I came into the job that you would just get a wall of skepticism about it because it's such a difficult thing to pull off, and that would sort of infect the relationship. And in fact, what's happened is energy industry has definitely stepped up. So I think it's tremendous that Energy UK, but it's not just Energy UK. Lots of directly energy participants in the sector and trade bodies have said this is a good thing, like we should be pushing to do this, and there's a much more positive discussion about that because I feel that we've responded to that in government too. So we've tried to move as quickly as we could to put some flesh on the bones of how we actually achieve this thing. Some excellent piece of analysis by the NESO that sort of frames that. Most of that was done in the first 6 months. We moved sort of heaven and earth internally in government to get something like that out quickly, and the energy industry's responded really well to that. So that is tremendous because it didn't need to be like that. I mean, it could have been a very different story. So I feel there's a sort of positive discussion about this. But of course, the skepticism about how hard this is and how quickly you've got to move and the things that have got to be in place to make it possible. So my other reflection is lots of people are very happy to come to me to tell me how hard it is. I know how hard this is, right? So I know more than anyone else how hard this thing is. I definitely would like more of that constructive discussion about how you can move things on in a space where there aren't these easy decisions. It's not possible just to pull a lever and get an easy outcome at the end of it. So how we collectively get to the more constructive discussions is a constant task. I took this job on because I wanted to do more of this sort of stuff. And I've always felt that there's a sort of gap between the ministerial stuff. You could have Ved Miliband or Michael Shanks sitting here. But I'm in the weeds, right? So I'm sort of understanding issues at a different sort of level of detail from a minister. And I always felt there was a gap, like the civil servant should come out more and speak about that. And that's me now. So I'd say the discussion about that is something I want. So the progressions that we need to make over the course of this year and over the course of the years after it will happen by doing more of this stuff and engaging in hopefully a constructive discussion about that. So I sort of open that up to the industry. The more of that we do, the better.
Well, we are up for the challenge. I don't think a day goes by where I don't utter the words ambitious but achievable. Yes, and I do genuinely believe it. Before I start coming to the audience for questions, can I ask you a final one about what happens after we achieve 2030? What's the next mission that you'd like to take on?
Well, 2030 feels like a very long way for me, and by the way, it's the end of 2030 in my mind. So we've got I'm taking every single day of that year. There's it's a really important point in this. So strangely, although we're doing this very near-term thing, looking at 2030, my whole mindset is 2050. So I've spent the last 10 years thinking about where we need to be by the middle of the century. The reason I think it's a good idea to do a sprint for 2030 is not because it's a short-term goal at all, it's because it's the first stage of the bigger goal and the bigger challenge, which is that after 2030, you then got to double the size of the power system potentially. Yeah. And this is just about getting match fit for that. And there's all sorts of good reasons why a sprint like this is important, because you can clarify what needs to be done in the short term. That makes Ofgem's job a lot easier when they're thinking about what you push through in business cases and how you support that as a regulator. It's super important to do this, because if we don't do it, we're going to end up sort of locking in more fossil use in the power sector after 2030, particularly with lots of new gas stations, which is exactly the thing that led us to the problem that we saw in the last 2 or 3 years. So the sort of idea of what comes after 2030 is that this is just stage one, sort of base camp for the bigger challenge that lies after that. After 2030, though, the challenge does shift, I think, to end uses and demand, right? We're going to have to electrify across the economy. I mean, I'll be knackered, right? So I'm not the one that's going to lead that. That's where the next set of missions needs to lie. And of course, we've got to do the prep for that now as well. So it's not like that begins in 2030. So all this stuff's in play. And it just points back to what we were doing, a few years ago when we did the work on net zero at the Climate Change Committee. Every stage of the path to net zero is stuff that we've looked at before. The big challenge is you've got to do it all at once. So I sort of feel this is the sensible thing to look at right now. But we then broaden out into all these other challenges, which are just fantastic. So I hope there's going to be lots of me's sort of leading those various aspects of that mission after 2030 as well.
I think you paint a picture of a very exciting future there.
It is. There's lots of this. I mean, what a time to be doing this stuff. Everyone in this room is going to be part of that period, so it should be exciting. Yeah. But I will be resting.
Well, I'm sure it's going to be a well-deserved rest as well, Grace. I think I might sneak a cheeky extra question in, if that's all right, before I come to the audience, which is public perceptions of net zero and the polarisation of politics. We talk a lot about misinformation, disinformation, the roles that we can all play in trying to demystify some of that. What's your take on the way that that's all going on right now, both in the media and the social media conversations that we see?
So I'm aware of what a privilege it is to do this job, and what a privilege it was to do the job I did before this at the CCC. So I've got quite a weird outlook on it, I suppose, having sat in the middle of some of that stuff. I witnessed the remarkable period when suddenly there was enthusiasm to do net zero across society and across politics. And then my reflection at the time was that it was a bit weird, and my reflection now is it was definitely very weird. But what a wonderful thing. So that it felt like a real period of progress from my perspective, someone who spent 15 years working on climate and energy. That was unique. And it came about because there was an enthusiasm to do stuff, right? Yeah. So and sort of, I that's something that's very fresh in my mind with this stuff. With the enthusiasm to build. Yeah. It was sort of sitting behind that, I think, enthusiasm and the reality of climate change starting to hit home, and people wanting to see something done about it. And then what the oddity of that period was that net zero took on this sort of it became a slogan as much as it's a scientific goal. Right? I mean, the work that we did at the CCC was about establishing, firstly, that it was the right goal, and then how you hit it. But I didn't expect it to have that sort of slogan value. That was politics picking it up, and we're definitely out of that period now. I mean, as much as I wish we weren't, that is definitely the period that we're in now, where it has taken on a sort of thing I always reflect on people. Very often now, mostly actually, people put the word agenda after they talk about net zero in politics. So if you regard it as an agenda, then you've got a problem, right? Because it means that you're going to have a schism across politics on it. It's not an agenda; it's an outcome. And it's really important to say that it's a global goal of net zero is just the point when temperatures stop rising. And it's very sensible for each country to have some sort of national target towards that, because otherwise we're going to get very toasty on this planet. So we're going to have to hold in our minds that we've got to achieve that thing, but we've also got to open up the question of how you do it. And that's where the excitement should be. And I was honest, when I left the CCC, I'm on record saying it. I was very clear in the round of interviews I did when I left that it had lost its potency as a sort of binding term or slogan, and that we need to get into the sort of guts of what's done here and then look at the benefits of those things too. So I think it's okay to park net zero as the only reason to do all this stuff. We're still going to do it, we've got to look at all the other reasons to do it. Now, why is clean power a good idea? It's a good idea because I think we can bring bills down. It's a good idea because it galvanises the whole industry to do investment they wouldn't otherwise do. It's an excellent idea if you worry about the national security and the energy security of this country. And it's a really good idea if you want to get jobs and investment into communities that need it. There's a host of other reasons you could do that. I haven't mentioned climate once. So I sort of feel it's okay for us to move into a world where the climate benefits are sort of secondary to those things. The climate benefits are still there. And my experience, going back to what we talked about earlier with the Climate Assembly, is that that's mostly how people think of these things. Yeah. There are some people who are driven by climate first, quite a few of them actually, more than there used to be. But mostly it's a factor that endorses something else. Yeah. So if you take to deep skeptics about doing anything on climate change, something that benefits national security, and then bring them the fact that also helps the climate, you win them round on that. So I sort of, again, with this stuff, I feel that's part of how you should frame it. But that is also true of the electric vehicle transition. It's going to be true of the investment we need to decarbonise industries. It's definitely going to need to be true about the way in which we approach decarbonising homes and buildings in this country, and all the other stuff that needs to be done. So net zero is still there. It just doesn't need to be the primary reason to do all this stuff. That was the weirdness of it. That there was a period when you slapped net zero on anything, and it was literally the reason that we were doing it. And that, I think it's okay that we look at the other reasons for doing this stuff, and that net zero is a sort of reinforcing factor for that.
Well, as someone who works in this industry primarily because I want better outcomes for people, I wholeheartedly endorse that. Thank you, Chris. I am going to turn to some audience questions now. Can I just remind you to speak into the microphone? Don't expect it to be loud in the room. Should all be all right online. And forgive me, all of the men with hands up. I'm going to go for a woman first. I'm going to take two at a time, if that's okay, Charlotte.
Thanks very much. First of all, Naomi from Statcraft, and thank you very much for publishing the details of the cap and floor mechanism yesterday. It's really, really great to see that. A lot of the focus has been on the impact that REMA and decisions on that could have on AR7. But I was wondering if there's been any assessment of the impact that the technology allocation pots in Clean Power 2030 and the new grid connections process could have on the number of projects entering AR7 and AR8.
Thank you.
Will you keep me right on this, because I'm terrible at remembering questions?
Yeah, I'm taking notes. There we go.
Very good.
Thank you. Stuart Barnes, EnBW. We're a German utility developing offshore wind in the UK. Clean Power Action Plan identifies offshore wind as one of the workhorses towards 2030 targets, which is obviously welcome. And DESNZ has built on that with the AR7 consultation and a minded to position regarding forward CFD, effectively, the removal of DCO requirement as a precondition. Declare an interest. We very much welcome that. We've got 3 gigawatts worth of project we think can deliver in time for 2030, strong grid connection, supply chain, all the rest of it, just DCO, and well progressed through the planning system. Nevertheless, some of our partners, including Renewable UK, are taking kind of minded to positions to oppose that measure. I'm sure you're aware of this. I suppose I'd invite comment on that, noting the consultation is still live, and kind of, what message would you send to those who are maybe seeing this as a threat or a risk?
So they're two different questions about AR7, aren't they? But worth wrapping them up in your answer if you can. So tensions in AR7 and
connection reform.
And connection reform, and a nice welcome for the cap and floor stuff yesterday on Long
Right, let's deal with connection reform. The most radical thing in the action plan that we published for Christmas was connection reform. And it will be, over the course of this year, we're going to have this process play out, something that absolutely has to be done. We have first come, first served process with a grid queue that is just enormous. Yeah. Stuff with projects, some of which we need, some of which we don't, some of which are real, some of which are less real. And sort of grasping the thistle, as we call it in Scotland, the nettle, to do something about that was definitely the most radical thing that we did in the action plan. And it's also the way in which we will, I hope, demolish the scepticism about how we do this, because you've got a set of developers keen as mustard up and down the country who want to actually develop their projects connected to a grid that's creaking. If we can rationalise that queue and take national targets by technology down to regional level and do that well, then we will repopulate that grid queue with projects that are ready to go and aligned with the strategy for 2030. And we've gone out to 2035 with connection agreements. So that's how you get a load of projects onto the system quickly. And I'm super pleased that we're doing it. There's some stuff at the edges that I think we're going to have to look at properly to make that work well. But broadly, it's working. So my thanks particularly to my colleagues in NISO who are going through that process right now. It's a mammoth task. We've never done something like this before, so it's also like, it's a hugely important thing that it works well for us. What are we doing? Having set that up, what we are doing is the other cool bit, and I'm very happy to tell you that bit of the story. So what is mission control? I don't love the term mission control because it's a slightly weird thing, but especially I get letters from mission controller, which is very strange. They're not always nice letters. But it has a point, right? So the idea of it is that there's something at the heart of government that is monitoring what's going on as near as damn it live. To do that, what we need is a key set of projects up and down the country that we think we need for 2030. So I have at the moment a sort of long list of that, and you probably know I'm a numbers guy, so I'm quite driven by the need to have data behind this. So we are building.
You have mentioned dashboards.
I have,
to me a few times,
So dashboards may not sound interesting to you, but they are to me. So the idea of having a CP 2030 aligned project list, we're basically doing that in lockstep with what NISO is doing. So we will in the autumn hopefully pop out with a new set of connection agreements for the projects that we think we can connect for 2030, with connection agreements out to 2035, and I will have in the middle of government that project list aligned to that. And then that allows us to do the next bit of the job, which is to get our hands dirty and make sure that those projects, we push on with those projects and remove all the blockers and do all as much as we can to get them on the system. What we are able to do, though, to come to the point about AR7 is have a really, I think, pretty good view of what we expect in AR7, AR8, AR9, even AR10. And we'll keep refining that because we want to understand that more and more. Because basically what is my job is to try and get as many projects aligned with 2030 to FID as we can over the course of the next few years. And most of that work is done in the first 2 years.
Yeah.
So I need to have as clear a view as I can of those projects. I don't know what everyone will bid in the next auction. So I also need a view on what policies we need to have in place across all of that and how we can minimise the cost of capital risk that I spoke about earlier. So that is what we're trying to build, and that is the sense what mission control is that we will have that kind of data and use it. And the key point is that although we've got some of that in government already, we've got brilliant data on offshore wind projects, for example, with lots of the stuff that you also need that is not numerate, that's about, what does that investor really think, or, that sort of more subjective stuff. But we don't have it in other areas, so notably in the network projects, so we're trying to build that up right now. But what we lack is this forward look. So I want to sort of spot a problem before it comes. So I want to be able to say, ultimately I want to say to Ed, that policy there delivers you 5 gigawatts of solar. Or if you don't make that decision there, you don't get that much onshore wind in Scotland. So that requires you to be forward-looking with it. So that's what the dashboard is. It's also what I hope will allow us to give intelligent views on how each auction round needs to be run or what parameters need to be. So coming to the second question, the things that are being consulted on in terms of the parameters for the CFD are all things that came through my team. And Sarah Redwood's team in the department are brilliant. We're basically sort of giving that team license to explore new options on this. I am super interested in longer CFDs because that offers the prospect of lower strike price for projects that are definitely longer than 15 years. And although there is, of course, an interesting merchant tail to those projects, strikes me as quite a sensible thing to bring longer tenor to the CFD so that you bring more confidence to the developers, but also to the resale market for those projects. So they're often institutional investors and they want that kind of certainty. Yeah. So that's something that is very exciting to me to see in that consultation. The most controversial thing in that consultation is allowing pre-DCO projects into the CFD. And I don't mind saying I'm less sure about that one. That is to me more of a punt, and I think that's it's a genuine consultation on all the things that you see on these CFD parameters. But I'm very sure that we need to consult on that one, because the potential is there for us to bring projects that are immature into the auction round and spoil the auction. There's also this great prize of having more competition in these auctions, particularly these near-term auctions, that would be helped by having more projects in there. So that is definitely a proper consultation, and we're definitely going to do proper analysis on it. And we'll have to come back to you when we've done that work.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly something I know that my colleagues are talking to members about right now. So it's good to get your view on that. And I think that it's really great to hear you talking about a focus on final investment decisions as well. More questions? Sorry, can we take Alan here? No, we'll do. We'll take two Allens, and I'm going to encourage a woman to put her hand up, please.
Okay, so the first Alan Thompson from Arup. Chris, I really loved your match fit 2030 piece. And if we think about the 40 billion spend per annum, there is one school of thought that could say the supply chain will react to the opportunity. Is there a case for preempting that through your efforts and helping the supply chain to pre-react, if you like?
And then
Second, Alan. This is Alan from NG. We are accelerating the transition in 30 countries. Chris, I'm glad you mentioned 2050.
Yeah.
So my question is about Clean Power 2050, or even 2060. I was actually reading the EMR documents from 2013, 2014, a few weeks ago, and they were predicting that CFDs could be taken away in the late 2020s. And that new investments would be sustained on the basis of a carbon price.
Yeah.
How wrong the architects of EMR were. We're currently looking at AR7, you were talking about AR8, AR9, talking about extension of the CFD potentially to 25 years. My question is, what happens in 2050 when we need to keep the lights on and we need to incentivise new investments? Are we in a world of CFDs forever, or does something else renew what we're building today then?
So crystal ball time, and I am going to ask a woman to put her hand up, and I am prepared to wait. Thank you, Laura.
Under duress.
Thank you.
Dhara. I'm fascinated by all the CFD and all the supply side conversations, but I also would love your thoughts on where you think what I would call the decarbonisation dividend. You've talked about the price coming down for customers. We've got an election in 2029. There is sort of clear commitment there. And when you look at your whole, the amount of flexibility that you're going to require to get to your mission, there does seem to be a lot of conversation about supply, but less on the demand, flexibility, and the opportunity for customers to be treated almost equally to supply, because they are as important in the plan. They might be smaller in scale, but I just feel we've really got to make the case that Dhara was saying about what are the customers and stroke voters going to get out of this.
Okay, so we've got a question on supply chain. Crystal ball, 2050, CFDs.
2060, I think it was.
and then we'll come to flexibility.
So let's talk about supply chain. So the other advantage of having that dashboard or list of projects that I talked about is that that's one of the key bits of foresight you get from it if we do it well. So we've got a bit of that right now. It's quite exciting to see it come together actually, because you get some, you can look across the projects and see some of the big supply chain constraints. Important to say they are constraints as I see them at the moment. So our ability to move fast is actually being constrained by a couple of things. One is workforce deployment, the other is the supply chain constraint that we want. And now we want to turn both of those into positives. So you don't want to be seeing it as a problem that you can't deploy workforce. You want to be talking about how good it is that you did, and I think that's also true of supply chain. Now, the problem with supply chains is doing that in the short term is genuinely challenging. So there's going to be trade-offs here. We want to build out supply chain that takes you well into the 2030s and beyond. What we get to do is sort of make conscious decisions about some of that now. So looking past 2030, absolutely, and using the projects that we've got 2030 to try and anchor some proper supply chain benefits. So can we anticipate some of that and step in with government? Definitely. So that is part of what I think we need to do here. We can use this very unique moment where we can bring together all these projects that we want to see deployed across the country and look at them in detail and decide which of these things match well with the industrial strategy that we'll have as a country, which parts of the country we want to see that investment happen. You think of something like cable manufacturing, for example, is a very obvious case for that. There'll be more than just cables than this, but cables is quite an obvious thing to look at. You know, it's ahead of need. You can support that kind of thing to come to this country and be installed here for all the stuff that we need to do as we build out the next part of the mission. You know, as we double the size of the power system potentially. So that is completely why I want to do this, basically. So that kind of data-rich approach to that is what I'm trying to do, because what we would typically do is sort of stick our finger in there and say we quite like that industry now, how can we go and support it? What we can do now is say there's a definite need here, and here is what supporting that industry or investing in that industry could look like to try and build out ahead of need into the 2030s. And that to me is core to this. So it's very exciting to do that because we're trying to do that in a very novel way. Interesting, that's definitely where the Prime Minister's interest is and the conversation we've had with him, along of course with bills. He wants to see these industries develop and the skills develop alongside it. So that is my exciting story, I think, about this. I want to be able to tell that story over the course of this year and into next. And it's very positive. It's hugely positive to do that. So this year, I think you should watch to see what we can do on it. I might answer Laura's question next on Flex. Yeah. So if you've not had the chance to read the action plan that we published for Christmas, you should read it. It's a great read. The key bit of it is a table which takes the work that NESO did broadly to look at what kind of power system we might have by 2030. They gave us sort of two scenarios, which are not hugely different, but they basically, the key difference between them is in one scenario we've got a bit of low carbon dispatch, which basically takes the pressure off. In the other scenario, the build out of particularly offshore wind. But in both those scenarios, we've got an absolute, technical term, shit ton of flex. And it's exciting, like, to have that. So we have definitely put our arms around that to say that we're going to achieve these by technology, these ranges, and most of the discussions are definitely focused on generation and supply. But one of the most difficult things in it is the flex numbers, both demand flex, but flex also on the supply side. So I feel that has not had enough attention. I know that Laura Sands feels the same way because she's definitely looked at it in different ways several times over. This year, we're going to do a piece of work on demand flex. We promised it in the action plan, but we need to get it out quickly because there's a very big number on demand flex that's got to have some policy around it to make it credible. The other part of that story, coming to the consumer side of it, is we definitely need to turn the whole story of the technology that facilitates consumer flex on its head. So at the moment, if you're rich enough, you can have all the benefits of that flex already. So you can have your electric car plugged in your driveway, solar panels on your roof, you might have a heat pump or electrical heating in your well-insulated home, and you can get the tariff that allows you to kind of play with some of that already and see the benefits of it. Wouldn't it be great if we flipped that on its head and took that to the people who most needed that kind of, it's not a technology story, this is just about bringing people cheaper energy through that means. So that's part of the other reason why I think it's really important for us to aim high on that. And the other story that plays out through all of that, and you would expect me to say this, Laura, because you've done such good work on it, is the story of digital and what you can bring with a more smart system beneath all of that or through all of that. So we're about to hopefully begin some really important work on that, and that's definitely something that is a priority for this year. Now I'll forget the third question.
The third question was around the 2050/2060.
Sorry.
Yeah. Will we still have CFDs?
I don't know whether we'll still have CFDs, and I don't think I've ever been asked a question about 2060 until this moment. So what is abundantly clear to me, at least, is that carbon price alone would not do what we're trying to do right now. And the reason for that is because we're still in the midst of a transition from an energy system where the consumer has to pay for fuel to one where the fuel is free, but the consumer pays for the capital cost of the kit. And that is increasingly true across the whole sector. And a CFD is an extremely good way of tackling that. You basically give a lot of certainty to investors to allow a developer to create a project. You stretch out the capital costs of that over over 15 or even longer years, and the consumer recovers that, is able to repay that cost over time. It's extremely sensible because it allows you to look into a future where the end state is the one we've always wanted to achieve, where we've got a mostly zero marginal cost energy system, and the consumers seeing the benefit of that more directly. But we're right in the midst of the period where that is a difficult story to tell because we've got to do all the investment. So I don't know where we'll end up at the end of that, but I do know the end state is hugely appealing. And I definitely see a future where you wouldn't need CFDs across everything to give that sense. But I also see a future where it continues to be important for government to facilitate that. It's in those parts of the world that don't have a CFD that you see the hardest task to build renewables out. So I think we're still pioneering the right approach to this, as we did with the CFD in the first place. And I remember how difficult it was to move from the RO to the CFD. And we don't regret that move now. So the next phase of this, I think, is to give a lot more certainty to what the long future looks like. And that's partly what REMA's looking at too. So we've got to tell that story, because I don't think it is an appealing story for us to have to put policy around absolutely every bit of the energy system. I fully accept that. But I also think if you look at the long history of energy systems, there are periods when government does have to do that, step in to get the investment to happen. And then you reach a sort of, an equilibrium state after that, and government needs to do less of those sorts of policies. So I'd rather suspect that's where it will be. I have no clue where we'll be by 2060, none at all, except that it will be a very happy future, probably flying cars, and definitely a net zero, and we will have finally arrested the increase in global temperatures.
Thank you, Chris. I'd like a flying car.
Yeah, I would like
Should we do this group here? Should we do Mary, the gentleman next to her, and David as well?
Thank you very much. Mary Starks from OVO Energy Retail Supply. I wanted to ask a question building on the points about Flex, about the sort of economics and the investment that's going to be needed in the less tangible aspects of the system. So from where we sit, in order to support demand flex, we're going to need to invest a lot in data science, cyber security, and it's not cabling. There are no hard hats involved, but it is quite a serious investment that needs to go in. How much have you got the economics of that in view, and the sort of considerations about the cost of capital, risk profile, and so on?
Good question.
Michael Grubb, UCL Centre for Net Zero Market Design. You both referred and acknowledged the difficult political environment at the moment and the struggle over political narrative. And my question relates really to your very last remark, because one opportunity I think we're missing is the future is beginning to happen now, in the sense that over the next 5 years, we've got potentially 5-10 gigawatts of renewables coming off their contracts.
Yeah.
And that can be used as a more realistic illustration of, yes, investment now delivers benefits of the future, and that is starting to happen. The challenge is nobody seems to be talking about that, and nobody really knows what to do with it, and it is certainly not visible or accessible to consumers. So shouldn't that be played into the narrative, more and more attention given to that opportunity?
Okay, and David in the corner.
Hi, David Blackman from Utility Week magazine. Thank you, Dhara. Thank you, Chris, for so far. Just wanted to ask a question about the we've all seen the reports in the last few days heading up to the spring statement, potential cuts for Great British Energy. Of course, in the last few weeks, defence has emerged as a massive. There's been a massive focus on defence, increased spending on defence, and of course, defence wasn't one identified by the government as one of its missions heading into power. So my question really is to ask you, Chris, what reassurance you can give to this audience and more widely, that the government remains as committed to the clean power mission as it was when it entered power, given the reprioritisation we're seeing of other government priorities.
Good question.
It's a great question. Do you need a recap?
No, but I might deal with David's question. I can always remember it backwards, so let's do it that way. I am absolutely certain government is as committed as it once was to clean power, because it's linked, frankly, to the national security question. And the other reason to think that it's a good idea is that most of the investment doesn't require a spending review. So it's pretty unique to have that situation where you can say, this is the thing that is good for national security, good for energy security, good for domestic industries that need to build the stuff that we will be investing in, and also that you can profile that investment so that the consumer doesn't see the immediate cost of that. And I don't know if there's anything else like it, actually. That's why it's so appealing, actually, to me. It's appealing if you care about national security. It's also appealing, particularly if you care about the growth objective that the government has definitely landed on as a priority. But there's no sense me denying that in the first year of government, the defence priorities risen right up the agenda. And if anything, I think it sort of makes the case for what we're doing even more strongly. So, I'm not the Prime Minister. I don't have the benefit of seeing him every day of the week, but I'm pretty sure he's committed, and that's partly because I think we can deliver for him on this. And that commitment from the top is basically why it's so exciting to do this, right? That's what makes it work. That you can try and create that priority from the ground up, but it's a lot easier if there's. I always think of a bit of string at this point. If the Prime Minister's holding a bit of string with the tension on it, and he wants it, and he's pulling it, stuff happens, and he continues to pull on clean power. So that's the best answer I can give to that. We are not seeing in any way step back from this, because it works, right? It's a very sensible thing to do as events around us change.
I think I was at Euroelectric last week in Brussels, and the conversation about energy security was really high on the agenda for industry in Europe. And I think it's safe to say that my counterparts in the energy industry in Europe were really warmly welcoming of Keir Starmer's leadership in this space. And I think there's something there about closer cooperation that we should keep pushing at, actually.
Yeah, I went to Brussels at the start of the year and heard the same thing. There's a sort of responsibility, I suppose, to follow through in this now, because we've made such a clear commitment of it. We had quite an interesting year last year with the closure of coal, which is, I think, on balance, a good story overall, about how it's played out for the power sector, at least. So that it's been a good transition, managed well. For the power sector. Let's be very clear on this. There's some other issues broadly with the coal transition, which I'm very aware of, but the power sector story is a good one. And the other point about last year, it was the year where wind became the kind of top source of electricity, which is and the next stage of that transition is this stuff. Yes. And other bits of Europe will pay attention if we see this through. So that is exciting to me. But it also links to the discussion we just had about energy security and national security. We've got to do this for that reason too, I think. So all those are good reasons to get going on this. Absolutely. What was the second question?
Michael's question was around the future's beginning to happen now. 5 gigawatts are about to come off. Yeah, and
the sort of rolling off of the RO contracts. You're absolutely right, Michael. It's quite an interesting period, isn't it? Because those costs fall off the bill. Definitely, we're thinking about that in government. I mean, I think that, just to make that super clear, that is the existence of those RO contracts and the fact that they are starting to drop off, but still driving cost now, is something that I'm very actively considering, as is the department. So how we handle that is, can wrap that up into the broader discussion of what we're doing here, definitely. So that where we go next with that, I don't know, but you've written some brilliant work on this, for example. And lots of others too. Rob Gross serves on my Clean Power Commission. He's looked at those issues too. So it's very live for me thinking about that right now. But I think the story of the renewables projects now delivering that long future that I talked about is one that we should tell. And then you asking me that question has sort of reminded me of that fact. These are projects that continue to generate electricity without that support. And we're going to have a hell of a lot more of that in the future, and that is a really positive thing, and that is why we began this whole thing in the first place. And we should definitely be more willing to talk about that, actually.
Yeah. And Mary's question was around flexibility, the economics and the investment around cost of capital and upfront loading.
Yeah, and in particular the investment not just in energy networks, but also the data networks and information networks that you need alongside that. Freely admit although that's something that interests me greatly, the biggest and most important bit of that we've looked at is the smart meter rollout, but it's a much bigger thing than that. So I would like to be able to sit in platforms like this and tell you a really good story about the benefits of sharing that data and information more widely, so that we see a lower cost overall to the energy system. that is basically how I think we're going to approach that demand flex project that I talked about. This is about moving into a future where, you know, a very much more renewables-led system with consumers that are able, informed by that data, to participate in that market more directly is the future, the long future that we've all been talked about. We're right at the races on that now. By setting that 12 gigawatt figure, which is a big number, right? So the 12 gigawatts of demand flex, we've sort of set the framing for that properly. But I take from your question something that I'm this is why I like doing these events, that we better think about that stuff properly and feed that in properly too.
Perfect, and right on time, Chris. Perfect. Look, I need to close by thanking everybody, our audience in the room and our audience online, and of course, Chris. I really, really appreciate you giving us so much time so early in the morning. I hope you've enjoyed it. We've certainly enjoyed it, and I can't think of a better way to kick off this new series of events that we're doing at Energy UK. We will try and continue this series because I think it's worked really well. My team will now tell me that it's all been awful online. No, not really, but I think whilst we're here, what I will do as well is I'll just thank our crew who've been putting this on for us. It's been really smooth from my end anyway, at least I hope it has been for you, Chris. I think you've got a really exciting job. And I'm going to take away from this a couple of things. One thing I ferociously scribbled down was net zero is an outcome, not an agenda.
Yeah.
I'm going to be using that. I'm going to take away an image of you in a sort of national grid control room / Star Trek style dashboard central with moving parts and of course flying cars in 2050.
Flying cars, yeah.
But look, honestly, it's been really great, and I hope maybe we can do it again in a year or so and touch base and see how you're feeling about it all.
Yeah, and I will have an even more hopefully compelling story to tell you about all that once we have that data that I spoke about. So. What is my final point? This is the year where you set all this up properly.
Yeah.
So you've seen us start to do that. Not just the action plan is the framing for it. The CFD consultation's out. The planning of such a bill is out. We're going to have a hell of a lot more on that. REMA decisions coming this year, and then connection reforms running through that. And there's a host of other things that are also sit alongside that. So this is the year we set that up. Yeah. So I'm very happy to come back and talk about how that all then plays out.
Look, the energy industry, my members and everyone in this room, I'm sure, and Energy UK, we're really up for the challenge. Good. So thank you for coming along. Thank you so much to our audience online. You should be seeing a QR code somewhere here next to my head. And for all of you in the room, we will also be sending you around a feedback form and things like that. These events are only possible because you all help us to make them so good. So thank you so much.